New piece on this Tuesday, June 13th, and we're continue our look at the book Redeeming Power and Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church by Dr. Diane Langberg. And today we're looking at chapter 4, which she titled The Power of Culture and the Influence of Words. I'll start off with this quote here on page 46 if you're following along. As humans, we are easily seduced and shaped by the culture in which we have marinated. We breathe it in constantly, and our culture becomes part of us without assessment. Its power is great and often unrecognized. That is dangerous. I when reading this, I remember a incident that happened back when I was working on my degree. We were taking a class on I don't actually remember what the class was about. Maybe it might have been abnormal psychology. Yeah, I think it was abnormal psychology or just uh, the general class where you're learning about all the disorders that are out there and so on and so forth. And usually when you take a class like abnormal psychology, you just start talking about what exactly is abnormal. Right? What we distinguish as abnormal behavior or normal behavior, and it comes down to what our culture says is normal and what our culture says is abnormal, right? So if I like go to uh, Home Depot and I don't wear a shirt, right, the culture around me will say like, hey, that's not normal, it's an abnormal behavior, you should be sure. Back in some places the culture might have been it was okay to go to places without shirt or shoes, and then companies, corporations, businesses started to put up signs because they didn't like it anymore, and they were like, "Hey, no shirts, no shoes, no service." Right? Just kind of communicating to the society, the culture at large, like, "Hey, uh, from now on, you need to wear a shirt and you need to wear shoes when you come in here." Right? And so that's like kind of like the basic concept there about abnormality and culture. And I just remember as we're having this discussion and people were kind of sharing things about their culture that is normal, but other cultures think are abnormal. And I shared about how I would eat with my food, eat with my food with my hands. Right, growing up in an Indian home, we would use our right hands to eat our food. Wouldn't use forks and knives really. If the meal was Indian, especially. And I remember going to elementary school, and there was like spaghetti being served, and I started eating it with my hands, and people looked at me like, "What are you doing?" Right? It was abnormal in that context, a behavior that in other contexts, I mean, spaghetti. Now I would eat it with a fork, but just in general, the idea as a child was like, I'm eating with my hands. What's the big deal? And so those were the kind of anecdotes or stories that were being shared. And then there was this one woman who said that in her family, they would blow on a infant's genitals. They would blow on it and kind of like wave at them or like tickle them. She said. I'm trying to be specific. This was like 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, like 2011. But I just remember it because it was when she said that, the class just went silent. And even the professor was looking at her. And I rose my hand and I was just like, yeah, that and the professor pointed to me, he's like, yeah, Reggie, and I was like, yeah, that doesn't sound right. That sounds wrong. That sounds like something that shouldn't be done. And the teacher was like, yes, I would have to agree that that's not a cultural thing, that like Reggie eating with his hands is an understandable mistake. There's nothing wrong about it. It's just culturally, look at it, it's like awkward, it's weird to do that. But what you just described is a crime. It's sexual abuse. And the woman legitimately thought that this behavior that had been done in her families for I don't know how long, it's just something she said her family did. She was surprised to hear us say that it was wrong. And she had a breakthrough in that moment where she realized that this behavior indeed was wrong. She didn't fight it and say like, "Oh, but it's normal in our family," which happens, right? There are cultures out there, and Dr. Langberg talks about it in her book. She says that she's heard people tell her that incest was just part of their culture, and she just was like shocked, like what? Like that's just okay? And there are instances like that where in culture, we have in our cultures, like we read before, we are in it so long. It's just part of who we are, that we don't realize that there's something wrong with it until somebody from outside of the culture points it out to us and say, "Hey, this thing you're doing in your culture, I think it's part of your culture, is wrong." Now, where debates can be problematic and people judge each other for things that really are not wrong or right, they're just preferences made by culture. Like we in our home, we ask our guests to remove their shoes. We but in order to do that and to ask that from people, I make sure that the house is vacuumed and mopped well and the floors are clean, so that when they come in, they're not walking on a dirty floor and feeling like, oh man, why did I take my shoes off to walk around a dirty floor, right? And but that's our expectation. That's something we expect in our home. When I go to someone else's house, I ask like, "Hey, do you need me to take off my shoes?" If I notice the floors are dirty, I might keep them on, especially. But that's just one thing that's not right or wrong. Like it's not a moral issue if people want to wear their shoes in their house, right, and they want to wear their shoes and they want to deal with whatever that the implications that means. If they're tracking in dirt or whatever, they're just going to clean. They'll do with their carpets. Okay, that's on them. But for me to ask that from someone else doesn't mean I'm doing something wrong or something offensive. It's just like, oh, okay, you want me to take my shoes off? I will, right? And I'll let people know beforehand. So if they want to wear socks or whatever, they can do that and cover up their feet. Like I understand, sometimes my toes don't look great, but as Dr. Langberg's discussing here, the danger is when we, and as the anecdote I shared earlier states, like it's dangerous when we think our cultural behaviors are, we don't understand how they're aligned and we think they're always just okay because it's our culture, but then ultimately they're sinful. And when it comes to church and abuse and the church, the abuse culture in church, it's a huge issue when we're thinking about it. We're considering how culture plays a role in perpetuating cycles of abuse in the church. Now you can see that the chapter has two parts of the titles: the power of culture and the influence of words. And it's our words that I should say that it's our words that push forward our culture, that support our culture, that shows us what the culture is all about. And so we have to consider the two as being hand in hand. Now, I wanted to, and so for that, she goes into the section. She talks about the danger of good words without good deeds. Okay, and so I'm gonna do what she does here. Just listen to these words. They're found on page 48 in the book. She said it's a block quotation, so they're not her own, and it reads like this: Today, Christianity stands at the head of this country. I pledge that I will never tie myself to those who want to destroy Christianity. We want to fill our culture again with the Christian spirit. We want to burn out all the recent immoral development in literature, theater, the arts, and in the press. In short, we want to burn out the poison of immorality which has entered into our whole life and culture as the result of liberal excess the past few years. Take those words at face value. They sound like they could apply today. She asked a question here: do they resonate with you? I see on page 49, when I first read this, I put a note: these words sound manipulative. Okay, there's something about these words that made me cringe back then. Okay, now I know where they come from. Maybe you know where they come from too, but back then I had a problem with them. And what she said was, one person who heard these words live when they were first said that had this as a response to it. This puts in words everything I've been searching for years. It is the first time someone gave form to what I want. And so, yeah, these words can resonate, especially to a Christian. You're hearing this thing, you're thinking about the culture that we're in now, the stuff that's going on out there socially, the fights that are going on legally. We're here in the state of Florida. We have a lot of that stuff. It's always in our face, always in our ears about what's going on. And so these kinds of words can resonate in a positive way for some and a negative way for others. But within these words, there's a lot of pretext. There's a lot of information that you have to understand. The first thing you have to know is, well, who said them, right? And when did they say them? And so these words were said by Adolf Hitler, okay, in 1933, and so that's a time leading up to the beginning of the Holocaust and everything else. Now, if you know it's Hitler, you listen back on some of these words. He says, "We want to burn out all the recent immoral development. In short, we want to burn out the poison of immorality." Right? He uses the word burn a couple of times there. And it shouldn't go unnoticed that his his method of dealing with this stuff was to literally burn people in concentration camps and to literally burn out what he thought was the immoral development in their culture, and that was the Jewish people. And at that time, there were churches that stood with Hitler when they heard words like this, like, "Oh, he's going to protect our culture. He's going to protect what we want as a society." I've read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a famous German leader pastor at that time, and he was one of the few voices who wrote about the dangers of what was being said and what was being done. He was worried about where the country was going. In fact, he actually, instead of leaving the country, he stayed there to try to continue to minister and convince the church to walk away from this path that they're in. And he ended up in a concentration camp himself. And I remember correctly, he died there just maybe a year or less before the camp was set free by the Allied forces. And so, as Dr. Langberg is progressing through this chapter, she's talking about culture, talking about the power of culture, and then how culture is influenced by words, right? An entire culture went towards this man and towards his messages through these words. And we talked about deception yesterday, and deception is a big part of it. You know, he didn't outright tell them, "This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab all the Jewish people in my country and anybody else who doesn't fit into our agenda, and I'm going to go ahead and put them into camps, and we're going to burn them alive." And he wasn't that specific. If he was that specific, maybe people wouldn't have followed him. I don't know, but he had to be a little deceptive, and he had to go ahead and craft his propaganda minister Goebbels. Would put together these messages, and they had to craft it in a way where people would hear it and be excited and be willing to accept that which was evil. And unfortunately, as Dr. Langberg talks about in this chapter, if you want to read it on your own, I really, again, I recommend it. We're just going through this to try to, bring up some awareness here. But as she goes through the chapter, she explains, she has different examples of how this is done in the church, right? And I do have some quotes here to share with you. And just in general, with words, she said, so patients trust therapists, people trust pastors, students trust teachers, men and women trust each other, girls and boys trust pedophiles, and entire nations trust politicians because their words sound good. So in that quote, she's talking about the danger of words again, the dangerous nature of words, and just threw in there, right? Like girls and boys trust pedophiles, and thrown in there with therapists and pastors and teachers. And she's doing that because she understands that in the society that we live in any society anybody's lived in, the power that people have over others uh, is enough for them to use words that sound good but aren't, and then to use those words with the purpose of abusing them in their with their power, right? And we've talked about power before, but a pastor, a therapist has power because a therapist is someone who is supposed to be a source of knowledge and authority. Same thing with a pastor, a teacher. Same thing with what I'm doing here. I'm a professor, trying to put this content out there. People will naturally just say, "Oh, he's got this authority. He's got this." He's got this education, he's got this special knowledge, or he studied and he got a degree and he's been doing this for years, and so I can trust them with my words. I grew up in a tradition where we were encouraged to be like Bereans. You know the story of the Bereans. I believe it's at the end of chapter 16 of the book of Acts. Paul went to Berea and he shared with them the gospel. And I think I've mentioned this before in other broadcasts. And it said that the Bereans were like, okay, we listened to you. They wanted to go and study the scripture on their own. And so in my life, I was taught, like, don't just accept what people have to say at the pulpit. Listen critically to what they're saying. If they point out a portion of scripture, You go to it and you read it yourself while they're reading it, and you study and look at the context, and you're listening while they're speaking, and you're highly critical of what they're telling you because you want to be a good Berean. You want to investigate. You want to know what they're saying. But unfortunately, a lot of people in our culture, okay, what I've seen in our culture, in American culture, are quick to believe those with authority, right? Whether they're teachers, therapists, and sadly, like those who are evil in our world, they're quickly to listen to them. I have to constantly teach my daughter. Like if someone says this to you, if someone says you're special, oh, let me give you a treat. Let me give you something special. You're like my special student. Here's a piece of candy. I would tell her, don't accept that. Don't believe that. Person's telling her something. It's nice. They're good words. You're special, but that's how they groom. It's like, oh, you're special. You're special. You're special, and then they start to isolate. Like you're different from all the other kids. You're special. If and I've told her, like if someone says you're special, like, hey, what makes me so special? Or don't entertain it, or turn it down. Or if they say, you're special, here's a piece of candy, just between the two of us, like, oh, actually, hey, look, Mr. So and so has candy, and tell all the kids, right? So that they come and they're like, oh, and then all of a sudden his little attempt to isolate her and groom her has been thwarted. Because unfortunately, like I said, those are good words. You're special. Here's a piece of candy, just for you. Those are good words, but it's the kind of thing it's done with evil intentions. And I wanted to go forward in this with some of these quotes. Actually, I had another one here, and I am missing out on it. Oh, here we go. In Christendom, in the church specifically, we can use spiritual language to cloak selfish ambition, hide abuses of many kinds, and do incalculable damage in the name of God. And so, it's easy to talk about pedophiles and those kinds of abusers, but what about the church, right? This whole book is about how power is used and abused in the church. And so there are definitely times when good words, it sounds like good words are being pushed out by somebody who's up at a pulpit, but there are the words that hide an agenda, right? They hide an agenda. And if you listen carefully and understand what people are saying, they do damage to people. Okay? They do damage people in what they're saying and what they're doing. Um, and oftentimes, like this past Sunday, we had this message going on, and this guy was saying stuff. And my wife pointed out about, he was using this anecdotal kind of situation where someone was saying to him, "What's the minimum I have to do to be saved or to be a Christian or whatever?" And his response was like, I don't answer that question anymore, because if you're just looking for the minimum, then you don't really want to be saved, or something along those lines. And I understand to a certain extent that viewpoint. It's true. There's some people out there who are intentionally wanting to live a life that is as free as possible when it comes to Christianity. Like, oh, I just want to be saved. I want to go to heaven, but I want to change my life. I don't want to live differently. I don't want to. I just want the good stuff without having to change and do any of the good stuff, right? So I understand that concept. But when you just blanket say that statement, okay, there are people out there, and my wife is one who pointed this out. There are people out there, people who may be watching this, who are really struggling in their faith, and they really wonder day to day, what is enough for me in God? Like, what is enough? Like, am I enough? Am I doing enough? And so they're not looking for a loophole to continue on in sin so that they can just do whatever they want and then still be saved. No, they're legitimately struggling, and they're wondering, what is enough, right? What is enough? Like, am I good enough? And when you put out a statement like that, where, oh, I'm not going to answer that question anymore, because if you're asking what's the minimum, then you're probably not trying. You just push that out there, and you don't add nuance. You don't add the sides to it. Then someone who's sitting there who's just struggling to make it as a believer, struggling in the sense that they have doubts, they have fears, they have anxieties. Maybe they're caught up in a sin they don't know how to get out of, and so they're really just struggling. They hear that word, they're like, "Oh, great!" Like that becomes something that's even more oppressive to them, and is more controlling over them. It's going to be something that goes into their head that's going to affect them in the long run. and in the short run, it's going to affect their spirituality in a negative way. Okay, and that's probably just the ignorance of a speaker who's not thinking about all the angles there. But there are those who will go up at a pulpit or get on a message somewhere and speak in such a way where that is exactly what they want to do. They want to discourage people. They want to encourage discourage them in a way that can control them. I've often said this, as a church, you can as a leadership, you can influence people by using uh, pain and shame and fear. You can shame people with your words and your culture and your church into thinking that if they don't fit into this group, then they're not. Then they're going to feel that, and they're going to know that they're different, and then that naturally leads to fear, where you're like, I don't want to be different from everybody, and then the dealing with the emotional pain of all that, right? So you can use that, you can have that in your culture, and you can say these are the rules, and if you don't follow them, you're going to be shamed, you're going to be called out, you're going to feel that you're different. I saw it in church a few weeks ago, where we were standing and singing. It's a very traditional kind of church, singing hymns. It's what I grew up with and most comfortable with, and at the end of the day, went to other churches, and I wasn't into more expressive forms of worship. But I really wasn't into it myself. Different cultures, different backgrounds, different denominations. Besides teaching, sometimes it just really is culture. And so when I went to these other churches and people were standing and had their arms up and they were singing their more expressive forms of worship, for me, I wasn't going to do that because it wasn't comfortable for me. So I would just sit there. What was comfortable for me was our Lord's Supper meetings, our communion meetings. This is the culture of the Plymouth Brethren here in the U.S., I would say, because in India it's different. So I'm guessing in other cultures it's a little different also. But here in the U.S., it's a cappella. It's super quiet. It's reflective. It's meditative. Someone may get up and read a psalm or something from Scripture, which is supposed to help us think about the Lord Jesus. Someone might, ask for a song to be sung, and these songs again, let's say, be sung a cappella. They're old hymns from like 1800s, I want to say. In the book, it has like the date of the 1800s, the hymnal that they use. So they're really old timey hymn songs and stuff like that. Whatever. That's that. Just even more, the words are extremely thoughtful and they're deep. And so you could read one of these hymns and be like, wow, that's so deep. Like, I just want to reflect on that. And so that was the hour. That was the hour of deep reflection and meditation. And so in these other churches where people are expressive, there's music going on, people are clapping and they got the arms up, that wasn't for me. So I did me. I would sit there and I would open up the scripture and I'd hear the songs and I'd just be reading and I'd be reflecting and I'd be thinking about the Lord. I did what I wanted to do. And I have to say, like, at first, like in some places I would be worried. I'd be like, oh man, what if people are looking at me and they're wondering why I'm not standing, whatever. But eventually I was just like, yeah, I don't really care, what people have to think about me. And no one ever did say anything to me, right? And that's where like the shame and fear, and some people can go up front and say like, oh, if you're not preaching, if you're not clapping, or you don't have the spirit, if you're not doing this and you're not expressing that, and if I'm hearing that kind of stuff, those kinds of words and that kind of culture, that's abusive, because that's not true. It's just a way to get me to do what you want me to do, to look the way you want me to look, right? And we're and what I was said all this because a few weeks ago there was someone at we were standing up at church, and we were at our church we're always quiet, but in before there's two meetings before the second meeting, or before the preacher starts, there's usually we sing some hymns with the piano, so there's a company there, and everybody was standing for the last song, and there was a woman who put her hands up in the air just as an expression of worship and praise, and she was happy, and she was just you know doing that thing, right? Which in this church is the opposite. It's like that's totally not normal. And there was one guy in the back who elbowed his. I was sitting behind them. He elbowed his wife and pointed at the woman and derisively, in a mocking way, did the same action. Oh, she's doing this. And that's the kind of thing, like that's a cultural thing. Okay, so what if she's doing that? If you're not used to it, okay, but you don't have to mock her and put her down to your wife, who probably is going to think like, I don't know what she's going to think. Maybe she's going to think like, you're a fool, why are you making fun of her? Maybe she thinks the same thing, or maybe she doesn't care. But he's doing that, right? And I can just imagine his words afterwards, the people he talks to. He's like, "Oh, this person," and just the gossip that goes on, and that's how cultures become abusive. That's how, and because of the system of that culture and the words that are there, and so a person goes to that church, and if they see that, and they would have, they were going to do that, but didn't. They see that just those actions themselves, the interactions becomes oppressive because it puts binds and shackles on people where they don't feel free in their relationship with Christ, to even express themselves in a way that, in all honesty, like, can we say it's wrong to raise your hand and to say thank you, Lord? Like, is that wrong? Like, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense, but it's not. It's a cultural preference. And so that's what happens in Christianity, right? And we do damage, and the damage can be even more severe than that. Um, and then finally, the last quote I wanted to look at from the chapter was this. And I apologize for how small it is. There's just so much there. I actually wanted to add more to this, but I was like, oh, let me just leave it there. It says this: opinions are not to govern character, no matter how strongly we hold them. Issues are not to govern character, no matter how biblical they are. Character is to be rooted and grounded in likeness to Christ, so that when we express our thoughts, we manifest his character and none other. And this quote comes from one of the last sections in the book. It's about integrity, words and integrity, and how what we say matters, and how what we say then influences our culture and our cultures in our church, so on and so forth. And she wrote this book in 2020. It was a time where people were on social media and they were tearing into each other. I remember we were still going to church. It was before the pandemic caused everything to shut down, and the pastor actually had to get up there and say something about people and their social media and their use of social media, because they were going on there. I think, the election's coming up or just passed. I don't remember. It's 2020, right? So, um, oh, the election was going to be in later that year. So it just is related to politics, and I don't to this day don't. I know that pastor's political convictions. I know where he would vote and stuff like that. But he had a problem with what some of the people that were on his side, how they what they were saying, right? And it's not just his side; it's both sides. It's the way they share with each other. And Dr. Langberg was writing at the same time as well, just like that pastor who went up there and was like, "Hey, you guys have to understand your testimony is being affected by the things you're writing on social media that I see, and it's going to affect like your relationship to this church and your standing in this church." Okay, remember it was kind of like that kind of thing. So just a warning, like, we can see what you're doing, right? And she was Dr. Lang was writing at the same time, and I noticed it too that time. And there's probably a lot of us who noticed at that time. Maybe it's always around elections, I don't know, but it was particularly hateful and spiteful and full of vitriol. And so there are believers out there who were just showing the nastiest of characters, and that's why she wrote this section here. She's like, no matter what your opinion are, it doesn't govern then your character, right? It shouldn't affect who you are, or how you display yourself. And the same thing with biblical truths. If I believe that fundamentally abortion is wrong, it doesn't justify that I then move forward in my behavior in a way that can be described as evil, right? Where I go out and attack people or go out and curse people, right? Jesus explicitly banned that kind of stuff. He said, "Do not, do not have this level of hate in your heart to call your brother, you fool, to curse him, because that's the same thing as murder," right? And that's a command that he said. And since he said character should be rooted and grounded in likeness, so that when I have an opinion, I can have my opinions, I can have my ideas of what biblical truths are, but when I convey them, I should convey them in the character of Christ. Okay, in the character of Christ. And she pointed out that at times Jesus was a lot more forward, especially with the leaders at the time, called them whitewashed tombs. But at the same time, he lamented at the fact that he said that he wanted to bring them in as a mother hen gathers her little children, ducklings, or not mother hen, like her chicks. Like, she wants to gather them, and he expressed like his love for them. So while he was calling out their sin and their sinful views and how they had negatively affected the culture with their words, At the same time, he was doing it from a place of love where he just wanted to gather them in and hold them. And that is not at all what I see out there in social media, what Dr. Langberg observed, what that pastor observed years ago. What you're observing is hatred. What you're observing is the kind of thing where people will literally get to the point where they just want to kill them. In fact, I had a student who, in a class not too long ago, uh, communicated some stuff, and I was like, whoa, I think that's crossing a line. We're like talking about killing people because we differ in our opinions with them, because it's the only way they're going to listen. That's what terrorists think. That's how terrorists move forward. I'm going to kill them because they don't do what I want them to do, or they don't believe in what I want to believe them to believe in, right? I'm going to bomb their schools or bomb. It's like that's where this quote comes and is relevant, because she's talking about that in words and character and deeds and culture. What I wanted to look at, just to wrap up real quickly, you can see I had some verses here. The problem does lie. The problem that we have with words and culture and division, it lies in the fact that we lack unity. Right? We lack unity in the community, and we lack unity in terms of what we believe to be the truth, what we believe to be the right way to go and to move forward, and how to handle sin, right? And how to handle uh, problematic behavior. We can create a culture where we protect abusers, because we've believed with good words of things about people. I talked about deception yesterday, and that goes in line with this. Like, where we deceive ourselves about people, and we use these words, and so we believe in that. And we create a culture where we protect abusers rather than protecting victims, that kind of thing. And so we need to develop a unity in thought and ideas about these kinds of issues. And yet, when we look back in the early church, I have this from First Corinthians chapter 10. They had the same problem with disunity. I don't know exactly, if they had the same kinds of issues that divide them today, but they had problems with division. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul says, "Now I urge you, brothers and sisters, through the name of our Lord Yeshua Messiah, that you would all speak the same thing, and there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind, in the same purpose." Right? And I think we could apply this to this conversation, that we would speak the same thing for them, right? For context, you keep reading, they they were dividing themselves based on who they would follow, right? And you have to remember, culturally speaking, in a Jewish society, people would hold on to a rabbi. You had a rabbi, you followed him. Jesus was a rabbi, he had many followers. When Jesus was asked that question about divorce, is it okay for divorce a wife? Moses says it's okay. Is it okay? Some say it's not. That was a debate between two prominent rabbis at the time, who had established two schools of thought when it came to divorce. And so basically, they were asking Jesus, which rabbi do you agree with, right? And so who do you identify with? And so this was a normal cultural thing to say, oh, this person's teachings is what I follow. I'm going to be his disciple. In India, they have this concept of a guru. They have a teacher who you commit yourself to. Like, I follow this God, I follow the teaching specifically of this guru. Like, and the idea is, as long as you follow your guru, your teacher, you're fine. You're going to be good. You just stay loyal to that one, but everyone could have their own teacher. A similar concept, I think, here in Judaism, and post uh Jesus, you have Jesus ascending, you have teachers come out, and they were divided as to who they're following. I follow Apollos, I follow this guy, I follow that person. And Paul was addressing that in Corinth, and he's like, man, there shouldn't be divisions among you, because we need to speak the same thing, because we only have one teacher. And so he was shifting, the culture was shifting, it was changing. Not shifting, it was shifted. They had to adjust to it. And the new culture was what? And Jesus talked about this, that you do not call anybody your father, you do not have another teacher. I am your teacher, you have one teacher. And so what Jesus was declaring, I want my disciples to teach you what I taught them, and then you teach what they teach you, and as they have taught me. Like, that was supposed to be the thing. So we only have one rabbi, one person. So that's why he says that you'd speak the same thing, and there'd be no divisions among you, that you'd be united in the same mind and the same purpose. That's the only way you're going to do that, is if you follow the teachings of one person. Now they're a lot closer to the time where Jesus was living and teaching and being able to know exactly what he taught. Have the disciples there. It's like you ask a disciple, "Hey, what did Jesus say about divorce?" Rather than saying, "Hey, what does Gamaliel say about divorce?" or "What does Paul say about divorce?" You say, "What did Jesus say about divorce?" And the disciples say, "Well, this is what he said, and this is how he taught it." Right? We're a lot closer to that time. We have the scriptures here written for us, and but are all the answers there? It's like if I ask, what did Jesus say? What would Jesus do with breakfast in the morning? Should we do it? And what was his method? Did he pray before? Did he pray after? What was his method? Right? Those specific kind of things we don't have details for. But ultimately, Paul was trying to tell them we need to be united. And there is a way, though, how we can be united now, even with Jesus not here. And that way is through his spirit, right? And so in John chapter 16, Jesus is talking about how he's going, and we looked at some of the similar ideas before. But he says in verse 7, "I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. For I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. When he comes, he will convict the world about sin, righteousness, and judgment. Concerning sin, because they do not believe in me. Concerning righteousness, because I'm going to the Father." So, that means what is righteous behavior? What is the right way to behave? What is the right way to treat people? Since we don't have Jesus to look at and be a model of that behavior for us, we need the Spirit of God to be that model, because He's going to the Father, and you no longer see me, right? And concerning judgment, because the ruler of this world has been judged, and that means anything pertaining to deception of this world, the Spirit of truth will let us know. And so, how do we accomplish this? This task of having this united mind. We have to rely on the Spirit of truth. We have to rely on the Spirit of truth. He's the one that was sent for that purpose. Okay. And this similar concept is also shared for us in the book of Ephesians, Ephesians chapter 4. Paul says, making every effort to keep the unity of the Ruach, the Spirit, in bond of shalom, that's peace. And he says, there is one body and one Ruach, just as you also were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one immersion, one God, and the Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And he goes on to speak about the gifts that we've been given. He says he himself gave some to be emissaries, prophets, proclaimers, good news, some as shepherds and teachers, to equip the Kedoshim, the people of God, for the work of service, for the building up the body of Messiah. This will continue until we all come to the unity of faith and of the knowledge of Ben Elohim, the Son of God, to mature adulthood, to the measure and stature of Messiah's full. And I actually covered some of this in a previous session about maturity. But yeah, there you have it. Like, how do we have this unity? It has to be through the Spirit of God. And how does the Spirit of God speak to us? He speaks to us in truth. He can speak to us through the scriptures. We study the scriptures, we read those things, and he can speak to us through that. He can speak to us through a song. You can be singing a hymn, a worship song, whatever, and the Spirit of God can reveal to you truth through those words. He can speak through someone who's sharing the word or the word, or a study, or even like a book like this. There's so much truth in this book, and we teach this thing at Trinity. It's like all truth is God's truth. So anything that is true has to come from Him. It can't come from any other source. And this book is full of truth, and so God has spoken through it, through the person who wrote it, has spoken through it in her writing. And I'm reading this, and there's truth in there that is prevalent, pertain. It's important, pertinent, I should say, to what we're doing, and what we need to know, right? And so there's truth everywhere. God is speaking truth constantly, and we need a spirit to be able to discern that truth and know that truth and to be united in that truth. And then only can we shift and change our culture, right? uh, and know, like, wow, that behavior is obscene, that behavior is wrong, it shouldn't be done. And then we can make the steps to change our culture in a way where we stop doing that. And I would say in Western culture, like the whole online thing, it's terrible, going out there and saying evil things to people, and just because you think your opinions are true, and they may be biblically true, your opinions may be biblically sound, but the way you're going about it is wrong, right? And so that's a cultural change that we need in the church today. And there's a lot more that can be said about that, but I think where I'm at, I'm good with. So We all need to be in prayer. We need to be in constant communication with our God through His Spirit. We need to decipher, discern, and speak the good things that can change our communities in good ways, and develop a culture that revolves around the person and the character of Jesus. Thank you again for watching, and I plan on streaming later tonight. I'm also want to say this: I'm thinking about switching to streaming on YouTube to see for a little bit, just to see if maybe we can get some more people watching live. Been reading some stuff about Twitch and how Twitch as a model is kind of slowing down and maybe even kind of on a downwards turn, and that maybe YouTube TV would be another option to stream uh, moving forward. So, just a heads up if you are watching live today. And thank you for watching. And again, share with your friends, family, coworkers on social media to be more positive influence out there. If you feel, only if you feel like this is helpful and profitable and good. Thank you again for watching. Have a great day.